All right. So hopefully you enjoyed watching that. And I saw that in your discussions, a lot of you talked about taking the implicit attitudes test and having a reaction that's very similar to mine, which is um, it's kind of a memory test more than an implicit attitudes test in some way. You know, that if you spend a lot of time trying to memorize the correct keys to push and are really worried about, being quick and things like that, you can end up looking biased in ways that are really surprising and not in alignment with anything that you would expect. I mean, the fact that Black respondents oftentimes end up showing a bias against African Americans is kind of an interesting, something might be wrong with this test kind of moment. So there's definitely some design issues. They claim I've taken it, I don't know, 30 times, something like that. And every single time I've ever taken it, I always have the positive adjectives associated with the majority that I'm testing, and the negative adjectives associated with the minority. And that's what I first learn. And then when they switch it, you're kind of responding more slowly because guess what? You're having to relearn the button pushing. And so they claim that, in the real test, they flip it, it's randomly assigned, but every time you participate, you're contributing to their data. And so I'm like, how am I always getting it in the same order? So I'm a little bit suspicious of the design. I'm just going to say that right off. I'm a little suspicious about the design. People love this idea, though, that you may be carrying around with you implicit stereotypes that you don't even know, and that you're giving out these microaggressions and all these other things that are signs to other people that you really are racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever we're talking about. So I just want to pile on with what a lot of you guys have said about your experience with the implicit attitudes test and say, I'm not exactly sure. Whoops, I didn't mean for that to start running. I'm not exactly sure that it's a great measure of what's really in my heart. So how do we reduce prejudice? How do we I'm struggling because I'm thinking I wrote these slides. So obviously I made the title, how do we reduce prejudice? Maybe our goal isn't necessarily to reduce prejudging, but maybe what we need to do is reduce acting on those prejudgments or something like that. Help us to be more flexible. What can we do? One hypothesis is the idea that the more contact you have with a person, a group of people that you might normally stereotype or be prejudiced towards, the less prejudiced you will be. And so the idea in this hypothesis is that, if you have frequent contact with members of the other group and in lots of different social contexts. So like, it wouldn't be enough to just know somebody from school who's from another group, but in fact, you know them from school and you have them to your house or you go to their house or you're on the same, sports team or, that you have lots of different contacts with members of that group. And it wouldn't also, you wouldn't want it to be a single member of that group. And this could be your best friend, single member of the group, and you see them all the time and all that. Because one of the things that can happen with your schema, if you only know one member and you know them really well, you can tell yourself that this member is different than the rest of the members of the group. So you can maintain your prejudice against the rest of the members of the group while being very, authentically good friends with this, what you think is special member of the group. So you need lots of different contact in lots of different contexts. When the contact occurs, members of the majority group need to be perceived by the minority group as modest and interested in the minority. So, now that's a tough one because it needs to be perceived by the minority members, and it's kind of hard. The majority group member might think they are being modest and they think they might be showing interest in the other, but it's in the eye of the receiver. And so you have to be perceived as modest and you have to be perceived as interested in the other. The minority group members have to make sure that their behavior is not reinforcing stereotypes that the majority group may be possessing, because I think I've already mentioned, Piaget says that you need to have like 20 experiences that are contrary to your schema before you will realize that your schema needs to be accommodated and actually change your schema. And so one instance of the minority group behaving in a way that's consistent with the majority group's preconceived stereotype is enough to start that whole count over again. So the minority group needs to not behave in the stereotyped way, and the minority group needs to be, the members need to be perceived as typical of their group, so that the majority group members don't walk away saying, well, those people that we just met today, well, they are unusual members of that group. I still get to continue holding my stereotype about the larger group, my prejudice towards the larger group. So with that California example I was showing you, and we finally come up with some negative stereotypes and things like that, I reveal to my students that I'm originally from California and born and raised there. And, let's think about that. Some of the things that they had generated were that they aren't that smart, or that they're really fake, or, they always have a tan. Of course, I live in Washington, so that's off. But, they have these stereotypes that aren't fulfilled in the instructor that they see before them, right? I hope. And so what do they do with that information? Well, most likely they're going to assimilate that information, and they're going to say, well, that's an unusual member. That's not a typical Californian. I mean, after all, when's the last time she lived there, right? Maybe she's become much more Washingtonian. So they can say, I'm just an unusual member of my group. Or they could say, see, I knew there was something about her. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something wrong with her from the beginning, and now that explains it. And so that's what we do when we're interpreting information, right? And so if we want, as a member of a minority group, as a Californian, I would like to say, as a Californian living in Washington, I want you to perceive me as more typical of my group than maybe you would naturally do. And hopefully I haven't behaved in a lot of ways that are consistent with the stereotype that you might carry about Californians. Hey, shout out to anybody else who's a Californian. But for the people who are in the majority, the Washingtonians among you who are listening, hopefully you perceive me as, a modest, hopefully I can perceive you as modest and willing to be open-minded and willing to be interested in finding out, how one goes from being born and raised in California and then not necessarily fulfilling the stereotype, right? Like that's the give and take that happens between the majority group and the minority group that allows us to start reducing stereotypes, reducing prejudice, and hopefully through contact, coming to the conclusion that, the member of the out group that is the minority group or the majority group relative to your position, they're complex individuals just like I am and like other members of my group are. Right? And we can start to treat each other as individuals. Another way to reduce prejudice would be through socialization, right? The things our parents teach us, our peer groups teach us, the media teaches us. So all that socialization, it's easiest for us to just transmit effortlessly and without even thoughts, cultural values or cultural attitudes. And so to change that and to convey something different takes a lot more effort, right? Like you actually have to think about the message that you're sending instead of just giving like things that would make people laugh or, things that we all sort of take for granted. Instead, you have to switch the message. And so the socialization can be a tricky thing to change. The media in particular, I mentioned, something that would be funny. A lot of times the media is trying to, entertain us. And so it's easiest to entertain when we use a lot of stereotypes because those are things that people all get. I was watching an artist who does cartoons and he said, yeah, I use stereotypical little cues that would indicate the sex of the person because I need people to, at a glance, be able to look at the characters and figure out what's going on with minimal words. I'm drawing cartoons. And I don't mean like moving cartoons. I mean the kind that show up in the comic strips. I'm drawing comic strips. So yeah, they're stereotyped, right? And so that kind of media relies on us all starting from a shared base, right? And so socialization is probably the trickiest part. Not everybody's on the same page for one thing. You can get conflicting information. And so going back to that schema, information needing to be very consistent in its message in order for us to change our schema. If you're hearing one thing from your parents and something else from your peers and something else from the media, it's very difficult to reconcile all of it. So you end up thinking whatever one you identify with most is probably the right one, and everybody else just gets discounted. So it's the socialization one is probably the trickiest part. Now, as individuals, we can take control of our tendency towards prejudice by recategorizing, right? If we can say to ourselves that it's not an in-group, out-group thing, but instead broaden our definition of what is an in-group. We've talked about collectivistic cultures. They tend to be very in-group, out-group oriented in collectivistic cultures. They tend to very much say, if you're a member of my in-group, you get like all the benefits of being in my in-group. And so I will do more for people in my in-group than individualists would do, but I do way less for members of the out-group than individualists would do. So individualistic cultures are much more likely to broaden their out-group. Now, do they lend them money or a car or something? No, probably not. Their in-group is not going to be helped as much as maybe would happen in collectivism, but more people would get the level of help in individualism. So like, if you belong to my in-group, I would give you the amount of help that I would give to any member of my in-group, right? And so one of the things, like, this is a team, right? So boys, girls, different races, everybody, like, we're a team. And so this is my in-group, this is my team. Now, of course, we look at the other soccer team, who some of them are our classmates, but nope, you're my out-group right now. Not going to help you, not passing you the ball. So when we see this recategorization where we can include members of the outgroup into our in-group, that helps to reduce prejudice. We start to have more positive attitudes towards what had been the outgroup because we start to see them as part of our in-group. So that's part of how that social contact hypothesis really works, right? The more contact you have with people of different types, the broader your in-group will be. And the more you'll recategorize and be less prejudicial towards members of what could have been your outgroup. All right. I'm sorry I had so little to say about socialization, but I got to say, maybe a different year I would have said something different, but I'm throwing up my hands pretty hard right now with the socialization thing. I think we have to take control ourselves and focus on this recategorization thing, because that's the part that we have control over ourselves. All right, so that concludes my what I'm willing to talk about with regard to prejudice. Our textbook goes into a lot more detail, and I will see you in chapter 10.